For day 6 of Stoic Week 2014, I'm going to focus on Marcus Aurelius and his work, The Meditations. I'll talk a little bit more about, the nature of that work and who this important author was in a moment. What I'm going to do in this is, as I did with the Seneca on anger and the Epictetus discourses, focus primarily on discussions about anger. And this will be a little bit shorter than the other videos because Aurelius doesn't have quite so much to say about it, although what he does have to say is quite interesting. And what we're going to find is that much of what he does have to say is in line with the other Stoics who we've looked at so far. That shouldn't be any big surprise. They're taking their inspiration from these early Stoics, Zeno, Cleanthes, Chrysippus, so they're all reading the same texts. They're going back to look at great figures like Socrates or Diogenes that they regard as sort of paragons of Stoic virtue, although they were not themselves Stoics. And Aurelius himself has read Epictetus and presumably has also, read a lot of the other people that Epictetus himself and Seneca are engaged with. So, again, it's no surprise to see him saying a lot of the same things. One thing that is a little bit different, and I want to start with this passage actually, is he talks in Book 2, Chapter 10, about an Aristotelian philosopher, Theophrastus, and he says, like a true philosopher, Theophrastus says, when comparing as men commonly do compare various faults, that errors of appetite or desire, the desire for bodily satisfaction, are graver than errors of temper. For one who loses his temper is turning away from reason with a kind of pain and inward spasm, whereas he who offends through appetite is a victim of pleasure and is clearly more vicious in a way and more or less manly in his wrongdoing. So he says, rightly then, in a truly philosophic spirit, Theophrastus said that an offense attended with pleasure involves greater censure, greater criticism, we would say, than one attended with pain. So, unlike Seneca, unlike Epictetus is a little bit more in the middle of the road, he's not saying that the Aristotelians are totally wrong about this sort of thing. He's actually praising one of the Aristotelians on getting something right. So I think that's kind of an interesting point of comparison there. Now, Marcus Aurelius is a Roman emperor. He's one of the few good emperors, as the historians call them, and he appears to have been a genuinely beneficent kind of guy. I suppose in comparison to some of the other Roman emperors who precede and follow him, he's going to look, like a stellar example because they were so brutal and so bad, so many of them. But he really does appear to have lived out a Stoic life in an exemplary way. He leaves behind this book of Meditations, which is a book written to himself to try to remind himself of how to remain within this Stoic orbit, you might say, or this Stoic trajectory. And he doesn't regard himself as being at the pinnacle of it. He has to remind himself daily to keep on practicing, to make a constant discipline and ascesis of this sort of thing. And he's doing this in one of the most difficult circumstances that you can imagine, in two important respects. And what are these? Well, one of them is the fact that he's the emperor, and the other one is the fact that he's the emperor. So you might say, well, that's the same thing. I want to focus on two different sides of that, and then we'll go into talking more about some of these important passages. So, he's the emperor of the Roman Imperium, which means that he is the master of the known world, so to speak. I mean, there's some things he can't do. He doesn't have perfect knowledge of what's going on. The Romans did have a fairly extensive, network for information gathering, for getting taxes, that sort of thing. Their bureaucracy was pretty good, although, plagued with inefficiencies and corruptions as most of them tend to be. But Aurelius, at least, in where he is, in the people that he's surrounded by, he is the top guy. So this is sort of like being, president and pope and CEO all at the same time. He can do anything that he wants. A lot of these Roman emperors got themselves in trouble precisely because they did exactly what they wanted to do, and what they wanted to do was horrible stuff. So he's placed in a situation that most of us can't really relate to, because he has absolute power, which means in a certain respect absolute freedom to screw up as much as he wants. And if anybody opposes him, he can have them killed. He can have them banished. He could have their tongues pulled out if he wanted to. So, that's putting an awful lot of stress on a person, because how many of us could measure up given those sort of circumstances? How often do we do the right thing because we're compelled to do the right thing, not because we truly choose in our heart to do the right thing over and over again, the way that Aurelius does? He's attracted to this ideal of Stoicism, and he's putting it into play in a position where there's nothing keeping him from doing the opposite. So that's one aspect of this. The other aspect is, it's a hell of a job running an empire, and he's got so much responsibility on his shoulders, so much stress. Again, it's difficult for us to relate to the level of responsibility that he bears. He is looked at as being the person who is responsible for keeping this entire vast network from breaking down. He's got barbarians that he has to face off, who are always threatening to invade. He has some military setbacks that he has to deal with. That must have caused him some considerable concern. He spends a good portion of his time actually out on military campaign. He actually writes in this about not having time to read, but at least having time to practice his Stoicism. He mentions anger in that passage, by the way, too. So, these two aspects show us an individual who, when we want to think about exemplary Stoics, we think about people like Epictetus, and we think about Seneca, and we think about Marcus Aurelius, because they didn't just talk the talk, they really did walk the walk. One of the key themes that doesn't just have to do with anger, but bears upon it in the Meditations, is this notion of preparation. And in Book 2, the very beginning of it, Aurelius says, "Say to yourself in the early morning, I shall meet today inquisitive, ungrateful, violent, treacherous, envious, uncharitable people. All these things have come upon them through ignorance of real good and ill. But I, because I have seen the nature of good is the right, and of ill the wrong, and that the nature of the man himself who does wrong is akin to my own, I can neither be harmed by any of them, for no man will involve me in any wrong, nor can I be angry with my kinsmen or hate them. For we've come into the world to work together, like feet, like hands, like eyelids, like the rows of upper and lower teeth. To work against one another, therefore, is to oppose nature, and to be vexed with another, or to turn away from him, is to tend towards antagonism." This is something that he's saying I should say to myself every single day, because it's probably going to be true. Every time I walk out of my tent or walk out of my domicile, I'm going to run into some people who are going to vex me, or at least have the potential to do so, because they are motivated by things that they don't even fully understand. They don't have their head screwed on right when it comes to right and wrong, good and bad. They think that what they're doing is perfectly reasonable, even though they're acting like complete jerks. And he's got a good listing there. Some people read that passage and they say, oh, he's being so judgmental. He's actually not. If you pay close attention to what he's saying, he says, all these things come upon them through ignorance of real good and ill. He's not saying that, oh, they're just horrible people in and of themselves, and I'm therefore entitled to write them off, or kill them, or do whatever an emperor could do with such people. He's saying, I actually have to respond in a different way that's not reciprocal to what they're doing. So he's just being honest about the kind of people that we're going to run into. There's really two sorts of mistakes that a person can make, and the better course is in the middle. One is to look at bad people and to say They're irredeemably bad, horrible. We can kill them, we can torture them, we can throw them aside. They're no good. They're not even really human beings. At the other end is who are we to judge? Let's not be mean to them. We have to make excuses for their bad behavior and laud them and enable them. And in the middle is the honest appraisal of, no, those people over there are jerks. But that doesn't mean that I have to treat them like jerks. That just means they are jerks. And I have to watch out for the fact that they're probably going to irritate me if I don't pay close attention to my own reactions, my own assumptions. So he's going to go on and he's going to talk about developing something like a house, a citadel, a fortress within oneself. That's one of his metaphors that he particularly likes. In Book 4, Chapter 3, he says, men look for retreats for themselves. And what are these? The country. Go to the country because you get away from all those other jerks in the city. The seashore, the hills. And you yourself are peculiarly accustomed to feel the same want, the same desire to get away from it all, to get away from all the other people. Yet this is all very unlike a philosopher when you may, and here's what he's saying that's particularly interesting, at any hour you please retreat into, where? Yourself. In being a human being, you have the capacity for interiority, for inwardness, for getting away from those things external to you that you don't have any control over. And a philosopher makes that happen. That's how you can tell, for Marcus, a genuine philosopher, apart from somebody who's just sort of putting on airs. So he says, nowhere does a man retreat into more quiet or more privacy than into his own mind, especially one who has within such things he has only to look into and become at once in perfect ease. And by ease, I mean nothing else but good behavior. So, now, when I read that sort of thing myself, I think, man, I wish I had, a little thought palace, to use a term that's been used in a recent drama, like that to retreat into, because I don't feel myself to have such a palace in my own mind where I can get away from everything. I actually still need kind of the physical space to do it. But with discipline, this becomes possible. This is part of what the Stoics aimed at. And remember, this is a guy who is bearing world-class responsibilities on his shoulder. So he says, therefore grant yourself this retreat and repair yourself. So you build this place within yourself by going into it over and over and over again. You develop what later Christians would actually call the interior life. And that's a very important idea, not only for later Christian thinkers, but for Stoicism itself, this notion of the interior life. He's going to go on and he's going to talk in Book 8, Chapter 40, about a similar kind of place that we can go. Oh, I'm sorry, not chapter 40, chapter 48. He says, remembering that the governing self, so the part of us that actually gets to call the shots, becomes invincible when it withdraws into itself and is satisfied with itself, doing nothing which it does not will to do, even if its opposition is unreasonable. How much more then when it decides both with reason and circumspection about a given case? On this account, the understanding, the mind, the intellect, is free from passions, as is a citadel of refuge. For human being has nothing stronger into which to retreat and be thereafter inexpugnable. That's a nice word. You can't be pushed out of that. So the idea is, if you actually work hard to develop this interior fortress, you can retreat within there and nothing can pull you out. Whether you're an emperor or a slave, whether you're, a man or a woman, a child, an old person, so long as you're a human being, this is a capacity that you have. The other metaphor that he has that I really do like, he talks about, at several points, a fountain within us. He talks about this in chapter 59 of Book 7. He says, delve within. Delve means dig down inside. Within is the fountain of good. and it is always ready to bubble up if you always delve. So, there's this notion that being a Stoic means like getting rid of your passions, your emotions, and then just being the same and unperturbed the entire time. For Marcus Aurelius, he's saying, no, it's a continual working process. There is this fountain of goodness within you, but you have to keep digging so that it can bubble up. Because there's always crap, detritus that's falling down on top of it. So you need to keep on excavating it, you might say. Later on in Book 8, he talks about this as well. And he's got this wonderful distinction that he makes. He says, as if a man should stand by a sweet and crystal spring of water and curse it. Sweet water means fresh water. But it never ceases bubbling up in fresh water to drink. And even if he throws in mud or dung, it will quickly break it up and wash it away and will in no way be discolored. So how can you possess this? How can you possess an overflowing fountain and not a mere cistern? What is a cistern? It's like a holding tank for water. A cistern would be where water would go into when it would rain so that they would have some water available. Here, they've got a spring, something that's ever renewed. A cistern is it's a certain respect a renewable resource because you're waiting for rain to come in. But once you've used up all the water in it, if it doesn't rain, you're SOL. Whereas if you have a spring, unless that spring goes dry, you always have water coming up. So he says, if you guard yourself every hour unto freedom, contentedly, too, simply and reverently, you will have this spring inside of you. So preparation and discipline go together, continual effort. How does anger distort our fundamental perspective on things? Marcus Aurelius has some interesting remarks scattered again throughout the Meditations. One of the ones that's probably the most evocative is where he compares those who end up giving into anger to runaway slaves. He says, he who runs away from his master is a fugitive slave, but law is a master, and therefore the transgressor of law is actually a fugitive slave. We all are the bondsmen, the servants of law, because law gives to us what is right. He doesn't have in mind human law so much here as what the Stoics understood to be natural law. So he says, in the same way, he who gives way to sorrow or anger or fear wishes that something had not been or were not now or should not be hereafter, of what is appointed by that which ordains all things. The Stoics think that there's some sort of providence ordering the entire universe. This is law, laying down for every man what falls to his lot. He therefore who yields to fear or pain or anger is a fugitive slave. We're trying to assert ourselves against the providence, the good ordering of the universe when we give way to these passions. So when we become angry, what we're actually doing is sort of isolating ourselves away as apart from the greater whole, and we're losing perspective on how things ought to appear to us. But it takes some work to actually see them that way. He has another interesting discussion, and this is in chapter 57 of Book 6, where he says that, here we go, honey appears bitter to the jaundiced, the people who've got liver problems. Water is dreaded by those who are bitten by a mad dog, those who have rabies, who, are pretty unfortunate still. And to little boys, a ball seems a fine thing. These are all about how perspective on things can get messed up. So he says, why then am I angry? Or do you think that misrepresentation has a smaller power over men than bile over the jaundiced or poison over the victim of a bite? Anger actually functions like some sort of venomous liquid that's coursing through us. The Stoics actually, their physical and bodily understanding of things was that anger was kind of a boiling of blood around the heart. But even if we have a more modern conception of this, what is anger doing to us? It's changing the way in which we see reality that we're engaged with. So we misunderstand it. We pay attention to the wrong things, and we don't focus on the things that we ought to be paying attention to. There's another discussion in Book 11 that's germane to this as well, and this comes in those 9 gifts of the Muse, these 9, you might say, commandments that he's laying down. Number 7 and number 8 are particularly relevant here. He says, 7th, it's not what they do that troubles us, for that lies in their own governing selves, but it's our judgment about them, about other people's actions. Very well, remove your judgment about the supposed hurt and make up your mind to dismiss it, and your anger is gone. Why do we, in fact, get angry, he's saying? It's because we perceive the other person as hurting us. But that's really our own choice. We don't need to perceive what they're doing as hurtful, even if they intend it to be so. We can see that it doesn't actually affect us unless we choose on some level to allow it to do so. So he says, how will you remove it then? By reflecting that what hurts you is not morally bad. For unless what is morally bad is alone hurtful, follows of necessity that you also do much wrong and become a brigand and a shifty character. So he says, if you want to get a little bit of better perspective on this, and you want to say that, hurting other people is morally wrong, and therefore you're allowed to get angry at those who hurt you, think about your own self. Think about how you also hurt other people, whether you intend to or not. And the fact that what you do, you don't see as morally wrong. You should look at them in the same way. There's a lens through which to examine them. Then the 8th one, he says, 8th, how much grievous are what fits of anger and the consequent sorrows bring than the actual things are that produce in us those angry fits and sorrows. The very feeling of anger itself is something that hurts us, that troubles us, that does damage to our souls. And evidence for this is the fact that we feel bad about it afterwards. He's talking about these following or attendant sorrows. Those are worse, he's saying, for us, than the things that people are doing that cause us to be angry and then afterwards cause us to feel this sorrow. One bit of advice that Aurelius is giving us, and himself, of course, in these meditations, having to do with anger, has to do with looking at things as being part of the way it just is, and therefore not allowing them to get to us. So he's got these, rather funny reflections in Book 5, Chapter 28. Are you angry with the man whose person or whose breath is rank? People who stink. Do you get upset with them and angry with them? Well, he says, what will anger profit you? How's that going to make anything better, getting angry at them? This guy's got a foul mouth. He has foul armpits. What's going on with that? I mean, nowadays we'd say, hey, buddy, you need a shower. You need to get some deodorant. Ever heard of mouthwash? But, what's going on? It's physical processes. He says there's a necessary connection between the effluvia and its causes. And then the next person says, yeah, but that guy's got reason. He can, if he stops to think, understand why he's so offensive. And then Aurelius gives this advice. That's really nice. Guess who else has reason? You do. So you can let reasonable disposition move reasonable disposition. If you think that he's a rational person and therefore you can hold him accountable for stinking, point it out to him. Just, say, hey, here's how these things are connected. And it's up to him then at that point. He says, let reasonable disposition move reasonable disposition. Point it out, remind him. For if he hearkens, you will cure him, and your anger will be superfluous. That's one interesting little bit of advice. He also talks about this in Book 9, Chapter 42. Not about, stinking or anything like that, but about this idea of taking things as they really are. So he says, whenever you're offended by a man's shamelessness, so, think about somebody coming to you and wanting to sell you something. You get spam. I get spam text messages. Occasionally I get these phone calls from God knows where that are, trying to sell me something. That's a good example of what he's calling shamelessness here. This, where you'd say, don't you understand what's wrong with you? And they say, there's nothing wrong with what I'm doing. So whenever you are offended by this, ask yourself immediately, is it possible then for the shameless not to be in the world? Now, what we're asking about here is not is utopia possible, but realistically speaking, are there going to be people who go beyond proper limits and don't even realize that they're going beyond proper limits because they're so screwed up? Is that something that you can reasonably expect to encounter the rest of your life? Now remember, this guy is an emperor. So if anybody had the possibility of saying, I'm going to get rid of all these shameless people and everybody on my general staff is going to be, modest and reasonable, he could have done it. But he didn't do it. Why not? Because even when you try to do that, it's almost like human beings have an infinite capacity for finding ways to screw themselves up, often even further than they started out being screwed up. So if you're going to require that people be something that they're not, you're always going to get yourself upset over that. He says, it's not. Don't ask for the impossible, for he too is one of the shameless who must exist in the world. Have the same thing ready for other kinds of people, the rogue, the traitor, and every kind of wrongdoer. For directly you remind yourself that the class of such persons cannot but be, you will be gentler with them as individuals. So if you say to yourself, people like this are going to exist, and he's talking about groups of people, classes of people, then when you encounter one of them, he says you don't actually have to treat them as that class. You can treat them as an individual, as a human being. You're going to be gentler or less angry with them. He says when you deal with them, you will find that none of those with whom you're angry has done the kind of thing by which your understanding was likely to become worse, and that it is there that your ills and harms have their entire existence. It's up to you how you react to it and what that's going to do to you. So we have a lot of examples here of some very interesting ones about how to think about the world that we live in and how not to get angry at it and the people who inhabit it. The last set of themes that I want to point out in this wonderful little work, the Meditations, and again, like all the other ones, I would suggest don't just watch this video, go out and get it for yourself. You can find it online, you can purchase it very easily. It's a common book at used bookstores. Read through it, see whether you think that this is really the case. But another key theme with respect to anger is this notion that what should our proper response be? Should it be total apathy, saying you don't matter to me at all, to the people who make us angry? Or should it be instead something like compassion, pity, even reaching out to them and trying to give them gentle instruction on how they could themselves improve their own lives? That's what Marcus Aurelius advocates. So he says, how inhuman it is to forbid men to set out after what appears suitable and advantageous to themselves. Yet in a way, you're not allowing them to do this. Whenever you are indignant because they do wrong, whenever you're getting upset with somebody because they're doing the wrong thing, you're telling them, you can't do that. You shouldn't do that. Even though it appears to be the right thing for them. They just don't get it yet. And what's going to help them get it? Is it you getting upset with them? Probably not. So he says, certainly they're moved to what looks to be suitable and advantageous to themselves. And then you can say, but it's not so. And this is the constant refrain, right? They're screwed up. I have to teach them. Very well then, he says. Instruct them and make it plain. But don't get indignant. Separate out the tone, the indignant attitude, the body language perhaps, however you're going to put it, apart from giving instruction. And then they actually can hear the message that you're trying to give them. And they still may say, nah, screw it, I'm gonna do what I want to do anyway. You didn't change my mind, but you don't have control over that. Another great section where he's talking about this is in Book 7, chapter 26, where he says, when a man offends against you, think at once what conception of good or ill it was that made him offend. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to totally get inside somebody's head, but it means that you can imagine why they might behave the way that they do. Seeing this, once you understand how their perspective is screwed up, where their their understanding of good and evil has gone off the tracks, you will pity him and no longer feel surprise, shock, or anger. For you yourself still conceive either the same object as he does to be good, that's one possibility, or something else of the same type. You're bound, therefore, to excuse him. If, on the other hand, you no longer conceive things of that kind to be goods or ills, you will the more easily be kind to the one who's darkened. So it's sort of turning it back to yourself. He's saying when you start getting, shocked or angry at somebody because of the way that they're acting, think a little bit about how they view things. Try to put yourself in their shoes a bit. And then, turn back to yourself. Because it's either one of two things. Either you yourself buy into some of that stuff, in which case you really don't have any good reason for saying that person's such a jerk and you're not. Or you've gone beyond that. And if you've gone beyond that, you don't need to be angry at them. You should feel sorry for them because they don't, like he says, their eye is darkened. They're like a blind person. Now, the last one that I want to bring up is also from those 9 gifts of the Muses that he talks about. And it's a wonderful little passage where he, this is in chapter 18 of book 11. He says, gentleness is invincible if it be genuine and not sneering or hypocritical. So what he's cautioning us against there is a kind of using gentleness, using kindness, using pity, using compassion in ways that are either passive-aggressive or self-serving, that aren't really oriented towards the other person. Because that shows through. When somebody is supposedly being kind to you, but they're really being passive-aggressive, that can often make you angrier than the original response that they had. So he says, what can the most insolent do to you if you continue to be gentle to him, and if opportunity allows, mildly admonish him, and quietly show him a better way at the very moment when he attempts to do you injury? Now, mildly admonish doesn't mean saying, I just don't want to bother you about this, but there's this little thing that you're doing. Admonishing actually means saying, hey, buddy, you're screwing up. Why don't you knock it off? But it's to do so in a way that's cheerful, in a way that's good-natured, in a way that's not putting them down. But, it can include saying, hey, you're really screwing up here. So he says, point out with tact and on general grounds that this is so, that not even bees act like that, nor the many creatures that are by nature gregarious. But you must not do it, he says, ironically, in a sarcastic way, or as if finding fault, but affectionately, and not feeling the sting in your soul, nor as if you were lecturing him, or desired some bystander to admire you, as if you're talking for some third person that you really want to, see what's going on. But even if others are present, just in the way you would address him if you were alone. So what he's doing here is he's counseling some very specific ideas about how it is that we would approach another person who's doing wrong to us, and we want them to stop doing wrong, in part perhaps so we don't lose our own tempers because we're not as far advanced as we'd like to be, but also because it's not good for them to be, acting a fool. So there's quite a bit here in this work about anger if we cull through the many passages. You see that, like I said before, what Marcus is saying is very much in consonance with the other late Stoics and the other Stoics that we've looked at before. So this is the last, for this Stoic week, of the text analyses that I'm going to be doing. The next one I'll be talking specifically about what I've gotten out of doing Stoic Week 2014.